now because you've played in an Everton Cup-winning side and a Liverpool Cup-winning side. You're a hero of Merseyside. Magnificent today.
I'm a hero in the blue half, don't have the red half now, but yeah, I'm just pleased for everyone involved.
Can you sum up your team performance today? What was so good about it from your point of view?
I just think we battled like mad. I thought perhaps we could have had 2 or 3 there, waiting on the break second half, but didn't quite get the finished product. But I mean, we soaked up a lot of pressure.
Some fantastic people who were trying to get this club back on a sound financial footing. I'd have been failing as a manager to come in and say success is 5th bottom, because that's not success, that's just setting.
The dark truth about Gary Ablett's horrible end is something that Merseyside, and frankly all of English football, has never fully reckoned with. His name sits in a place in this city's history that no one else has ever reached. The only footballer ever to win the FA Cup with both Liverpool and Everton. A local man, a quiet man, someone who carried himself with genuine dignity through everything the game threw at him. And what the game threw at him was considerable. If this story matters to you, hit the hype button right now and give this video some hype so more people can actually hear what happened to Gary Ablett. 2 of the fiercest rivals in English football, clubs separated by a few miles of city streets and a lifetime of fierce and deeply felt loyalty on both sides. And he won the biggest domestic cup competition in the country with both of them. That is not a small thing. That is not a coincidence or a quirk of circumstance. That is a legacy that required real footballing quality, quiet professionalism, and a kind of personal character that most people in the sport never get the opportunity to demonstrate. Gary Ablett was a Merseyside institution, a man who understood this city in a way that only someone born and raised right inside it can ever truly claim. Think carefully about what that record actually required. Winning the FA Cup with Liverpool in the late 1980s meant surviving and contributing meaningfully inside the most intense footballing environment in England at the absolute peak of that club's historic power. It meant showing up in the biggest games, earning the trust of managers who operated at the highest possible level of expectation, and giving something real to one of the finest club sides this country has ever produced. And then to cross the city to Everton and do the exact same thing with a completely different group of supporters, in the full knowledge of the personal hostility that would follow him through the streets of his own city, required something beyond football ability alone. It required a person of genuine substance, quiet determination, and a resilience built from years of navigating environments that were rarely kind to him. Gary Ablett was that person, completely and undeniably. And the game he devoted his entire working life to repaid him with a system that failed him in almost every direction it possibly could. Behind that remarkable legacy is a dark truth that his wife Jacqueline Ablett has spent years trying to pull fully into the open. She calls it an exposure of the system, and the more closely you examine what Gary Ablett actually experienced across the full arc of his career and his final years, the more that phrase lands with complete and fully deserved weight. Because this is not simply a sad story about a footballer who fell ill and died before his time. This is the story of a man who was ground down, layer by layer, across decades, by a football culture that treated him as a useful instrument and had absolutely nothing left to offer him the moment he was no longer needed. Psychological pressure from the very first day of his professional life, public abuse after a legitimate and entirely reasonable career decision, financial catastrophe during an impossible management spell that no one gave him the tools to survive, and a growing body of scientific evidence suggesting that the ground he worked on every single day for years across multiple clubs may have contributed to the cancer that took his life at just 46 years old. Let us start where the story truly breaks apart. July 2010. Gary Ablett has just joined the coaching staff at Ipswich Town. He is 44 years old. He has come through a grueling and ultimately unwinnable spell managing Stockport County under impossible financial conditions. But he is back in the sport he loves, back on a training ground in the early morning, back in the environment he understood better than almost anywhere else in his life. And then, right there on the Ipswich Town training pitch, his body gives out beneath him. He collapses. The diagnosis that follows is non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system, which is the network inside your body responsible for fighting infection and disease. The specific variant Gary had was aggressive in nature, moved fast, and was extremely difficult to treat. What followed was 16 months of suffering that his family has described as harrowing from start to absolute finish. 16 months that took a fit, active, lifelong professional athlete and gradually reduced him to a shadow of the man his family and friends had known throughout his entire life. It is worth pausing on what it means for someone like Gary Ablett to receive a diagnosis like that. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life in professional sport. Physical fitness was not just his career, it was his identity, his routine, and the framework through which he had understood himself and the world since his teenage years. Football had shaped how he moved, how he thought, what he did every morning, and then, without warning, the body that had been his professional instrument for 3 decades simply stopped cooperating. The shock of that, for a man whose entire sense of professional self was built on physical capability and daily active routine, is something that words struggle to fully capture. But Jacqueline Ablett has spoken about it with a clarity and honesty that makes it real. And what makes her account so powerful is not just the clinical detail, it is the humanity running through every part of it. Jacqueline Ablett has spoken with tremendous and painful openness about what Gary went through during those 16 months. When you hear the details laid out one after another, the word horrible does not feel like an exaggeration, it feels like an understatement. The medical team deployed every available weapon against this cancer. Intensive chemotherapy was the first and primary line of attack, round after round of it. The kind of treatment that does not simply target the diseased cells while leaving the surrounding healthy tissue intact. It works comprehensively through the body, causing widespread damage in the process of fighting the disease. His natural immune system was largely dismantled during the treatment. While the chemotherapy fought the cancer, his body was left with almost no defenses against anything else. He was managing 2 simultaneous crises, and both were taking ground from him at the same time. Then came the lumbar punctures. For anyone unfamiliar with this procedure, a lumbar puncture involves inserting a needle into the lower back to draw out and analyze the fluid that surrounds and cushions the spinal cord. Gary Ablett underwent more than 40 of those procedures during the course of his illness. Not once or twice, not 5 or 10 times, more than 40 separate occasions where he lay still and endured a deeply invasive and deeply uncomfortable medical intervention. Each one carried out as part of the sustained effort to monitor the spread of the cancer through the spinal fluid and to deliver treatment directly to where the disease was reaching. The sheer frequency of those procedures communicates the nature and the persistence of that cancer more powerfully than any clinical description alone could manage. A bone marrow transplant was attempted. This is a procedure in which the diseased blood-producing cells inside the bones are deliberately wiped out and replaced with healthy donor cells, attempting to rebuild the entire blood system from the foundations upward. It is among the most physically demanding medical interventions available in modern oncology, reserved for patients where other lines of treatment have been exhausted or have ceased to provide any meaningful effect. Gary Ablett went through it. He and his family held on to the hope that procedure represented, and it did not provide the outcome they had been praying for. The cancer had established too strong a hold by that stage. The steroids administered alongside the chemotherapy produced side effects that were severe and deeply distressing for everyone close to Gary. His physical appearance changed dramatically over the course of the treatment. The man described by everyone who knew him as naturally mild-mannered, gentle and quietly spoken became unrecognizable when he looked at his own reflection. His face swelled and altered from the medication. The steroids also began changing his personality and behavior in ways that were painful to witness. People who had known Gary for many years described moments of aggression and sharp irritability that bore no resemblance to the person they had always known. This is a documented pharmacological consequence of high-dose steroid therapy, referred to clinically as steroid psychosis or significant mood lability. It is a chemical process in the brain, not a reflection of the person underneath. But knowing that does not reduce the pain of watching someone you love become someone unfamiliar in front of you. The treatment caused additional serious complications on top of everything else. Gary developed diabetes as a direct result of the treatment regimen his doctors had to follow. He also developed Bell's palsy, a condition that produces a permanent drooping or paralysis of one side of the face due to damage to the facial nerve. So alongside the lymphoma, alongside a compromised immune system, alongside more than 40 lumbar punctures and a failed bone marrow transplant, Gary Ablett was also managing treatment-induced diabetes and a face permanently changed by the medication designed to keep him alive. His body had become a place where multiple crises competed for space simultaneously, and through all of it, Jacqueline and the family sat beside him, watching, supporting, hoping that tomorrow might bring something different from today. The man who had stood on training grounds across Merseyside for decades, who had played in FA Cup finals and been part of 2 championship-winning clubs, was now spending his days in hospitals and treatment rooms, his body being put through procedures of increasing intensity and diminishing return. Each treatment was a form of hope, and each one, while it kept fighting the disease, also took something more from him. That tension between the treatment that might save him and the damage it was doing to him ran through every single day of those 16 months. Gary Ablett died on New Year's Day 2012. He was 46 years old. The first morning of a brand new year that he would not live to see unfold. A day that for millions of people across the country represented fresh starts and new beginnings was the day this man, who had given the game everything it asked of him, drew his last breath. His family believes that his death did not have to arrive so early and did not have to be so brutal and relentless in its nature. They believe a different system, one that took the welfare of the people inside the sport more genuinely seriously, might have protected him at several points across his life. And to understand the full weight of that belief, you need to go back to where Gary Ablett's relationship with football began. The year is 1982. Gary Ablett signs as an apprentice at Liverpool Football Club, a local lad from Merseyside, stepping into the most powerful and successful club in English football at that precise moment in history. Liverpool in the early 1980s are not simply a strong team, they are historically and almost uniquely dominant. Regular champions of England, multiple winners of the European Cup. The Anfield boot room is spoken of with genuine reverence throughout the football world, as a model of sustained collective excellence, built and refined across decades of consistent winning. And Gary Ablett, a teenager with a natural shyness and a persistent undercurrent of self-doubt, is walking straight into the heart of all of it. In his autobiography, The Game of My Life, Gary described the Liverpool dressing room environment as daunting, that specific word. Not exciting, not inspiring, daunting. He was honest about the shyness that had always been a fundamental part of his character, and honest about the self-doubt that followed him, even as his talent was clearly opening professional doors. The culture he had entered offered no framework for supporting young athletes dealing with the psychological weight of that particular environment. The boot room philosophy produced magnificent winning teams with remarkable and enduring consistency. But it was not designed to be a nurturing or emotionally supportive space for a quiet teenager trying to make sense of his own internal uncertainties alongside the demands of elite professional football at its most relentless. You performed at the required standard, or you were removed. Nobody sat you down and asked how you were managing as a person. That was entirely your own challenge to navigate. Gary Ablett navigated it because he had the resilience that was required, but the system around him never made it easier for him to do so. His first-team debut arrived in December 1986 in a match against Charlton Athletic. He got the call because 2 established defenders, Barry Venison and Mark Lawrenson, were both injured and unavailable on the same day. Not a planned moment of elevation, not a manager deciding a young player had earned his opportunity through months of outstanding training performances. 2 senior players unavailable, and Gary Ablett was the option available. That single moment established the complete and enduring template for his entire Liverpool career. He was not the first choice. He was the contingency, the utility man, the option the manager reached for when the preferred arrangement had broken down. The quality he brought to that role, though, was consistent and genuine. He made 22 league appearances in the 1987-1988 season as Liverpool won the First Division Championship. He played 35 league matches in the 1988-1989 campaign and collected an FA Cup winners' medal at the end of it. He contributed 15 league appearances in the 1989-1990 season as Liverpool won another league title. 2 championship campaigns and a cup triumph running through his record. These are the contributions of a player who delivered when the team required him to deliver, not the tallies of someone marking time at the periphery of the squad. But the utility role at a club operating at that level carried a psychological cost that never fully went away. Gary Ablett lived with the constant awareness that he could be set aside the moment the established names were fit and available again. The manager valued his versatility and his reliability right up until those qualities were no longer needed. That persistent sense of impermanence, accumulating quietly across years at the most intense club in England, combined with his natural shyness and the relentless pressure atmosphere of one of the most demanding dressing rooms in European football, built into something heavier than any single moment could express. He gave consistently, without complaint, and with genuine quality. The club gave him results and appearances in return. It never gave him security or a lasting sense of belonging. In 1991, Kenny Dalglish left Liverpool and Graham Souness arrived to take charge. The atmosphere inside the club shifted almost overnight, and fundamentally, Souness managed with a confrontational directness that had nothing in common with the philosophy that had come before him. Where the boot room approach had been built on collective earned trust and a nuanced understanding of how to manage different personalities across years of shared work, Souness brought a harder and more divisive edge to the operation. Gary Ablett found the change genuinely difficult to adjust to. The club itself was going through an identity crisis that ran deeper than any individual player's experience of it. The culture that had driven consistent success for a generation was being dismantled from within, and what was being constructed in its place felt uncomfortable and uncertain to the players who had thrived under the old philosophy. In 1992, Gary Ablett left Liverpool for Everton. The transfer fee was £750,000. In most cities in England, a move between two clubs in the same area is a routine career transaction that passes with modest attention. In Liverpool, it carries a completely different weight. The divide between red and blue in that city runs through families, through entire streets and communities, through decades of shared neighbourhood life and fiercely maintained allegiance. The Merseyside derby is not simply a football match. It is an expression of identity and belonging that for large numbers of supporters goes much deeper than sport alone. For Gary Ablett, born and raised in Liverpool, the social consequences of that transfer were immediate, personal, and genuinely difficult to absorb. Sections of the Liverpool support turned against him publicly. He faced personal abuse in the streets of his own city. People who had cheered his contributions in a red shirt now pointed at him as a symbol of the club's decline, scapegoating him for problems that had absolutely nothing to do with his decision to take a career opportunity at Everton. The logic had no coherence whatsoever. Gary Ablett had not caused Liverpool's difficulties in the early 1990s. He had not brought Graham Souness through the door. He had not dismantled the boot room culture. He was a professional footballer whose circumstances had changed under a new regime, responding to those changed circumstances by making a professional decision. But the culture of cross-city tribalism surrounding the Merseyside rivalry had no interest in reasonable assessments. The system of supporter identity made Gary Ablett carry a weight that was never rightfully his to carry. What he did in the face of that sustained hostility says more about his character than any description of it can. He did not crumble. He did not seek to make a point or demand recognition for the injustice. He went to Goodison Park, kept his head down completely, and allowed his performances to do the speaking. He became part of the Everton squad that won the FA Cup in 1995. That Everton team was known throughout football as the Dogs of War, a hard-working, physically committed, deeply united side that large sections of the football press had dismissed before the competition had properly started. They won it. They defeated Manchester United in the final at Wembley. Gary Ablett was in that winning team. He had now achieved something that no other footballer in the entire recorded history of the sport had managed before him. He had won the FA Cup, with both clubs on either side of the most passionately contested cross-city rivalry in English football. One red medal and one blue medal. The same city, one man. That record belongs to him alone, and it always will. By the 1995 to 1996 season, the physical accumulation of years of professional football at the highest level had become impossible to ignore. He lost his starting place to Andy Hinchcliffe. The top-flight playing career was reaching its natural conclusion. Gary chose to move into coaching rather than walk away from the game entirely, carrying his deep knowledge of the sport forward into a new professional chapter. And it was in that coaching and management phase that the system found entirely new and equally damaging ways to let him down. In 2009, Gary Ablett was appointed manager of Stockport County. On the surface, a genuine chance to build a managerial career at Football League level. From inside the job, from the very first day he walked through the door, the reality was something fundamentally different. Stockport County were in formal administration when he accepted the role. The club owed £250,000 directly to HMRC. There was a separate unpaid loan petition standing at £300,000. The total financial picture of the club made operating as a professional football outfit in any meaningful sense barely achievable from the outset. His transfer budget was zero, not small or severely restricted, literally £0 to spend on improving the squad. His scouting infrastructure had been stripped back to almost nothing practical. He could not bring in the quality of players required to give the team any realistic competitive chance in the Football League. The governing body's regulatory framework provided no meaningful protection or structural safety net for a manager placed directly into this kind of crisis situation. There was nothing above him providing guidance, resource, or genuine support. Just a club drowning in debt, an institutional indifference to the impossible nature of what was being asked of him, and external expectations that bore absolutely no relationship to the actual working conditions he faced daily. Stockport were relegated. They finished 24th in the table, 25 points from the safety that would have kept them in the division. The story that attached to Gary Ablett after that season described him as a manager who had not been good enough for the role. That story was not just unfair, it was factually wrong. What happened at Stockport was systemic failure running from top to bottom, a club placed in an impossible financial position, a governing body that had provided no adequate structural support or protection for either the club or its manager, and a man set up to fail from day one by circumstances entirely beyond his control. His professional reputation absorbed damage that had nothing to do with his decisions or his ability as a football manager. The system and the club it had allowed to collapse to that state failed Gary Ablett, not the other way around. He moved to Ipswich Town as part of the coaching staff shortly after leaving Stockport, and in July 2010, the collapse on the training ground happened. But the question Jacqueline Ablett has been raising steadily ever since goes far beyond the individual facts of her husband's diagnosis. It has direct implications for every professional footballer, every coach, and every person who trains and works regularly on modern artificial football pitches. And it is a question the governing bodies of the sport have been very slow to face with the honesty and seriousness it genuinely deserves. Could Gary's cancer have been connected to his long-term daily exposure to the crumb rubber infill used in 3G and 4G artificial pitches? Jacqueline believes it may have been, and the scientific concern underpinning that belief is real, peer-reviewed, and becoming harder to dismiss with each year of accumulated independent research. Crumb rubber infill is the small black pellets found on any modern artificial pitch. They sit between the synthetic grass blades and provide the surface with its bounce and cushion underfoot. They are manufactured from recycled vehicle tyres, shredded and reduced to tiny fragments. Step onto a 3G pitch and those pellets transfer onto your boots, your skin and your kit within minutes of arriving. When the surface is disturbed by physical activity during a session, those particles become airborne. For a coach spending several hours every day on that surface, the exposure is sustained, cumulative and occupational in its frequency and nature. In 2019, researchers at Yale University published a detailed study examining the chemical composition of crumb rubber infill. The findings were striking. 306 separate chemicals were identified within the rubber pellets. 52 of those chemicals were classified as known or probable carcinogens. A carcinogen is a substance with the capacity to cause cancer in living human tissue. 52 potential cancer-causing substances present in the material beneath the feet and hands of every professional player and coach working on a 3G surface every single working day across their entire career. The specific chemicals of concern include polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which become airborne as dust when the rubber surface is disturbed during play, and are directly linked to DNA mutation and cancer development in the human body. Benzene, a chemical specifically associated with leukemia and lymphoma, absorbed through inhalation of the air immediately above the pitch surface during training. Heavy metals, including lead, mercury, and arsenic, absorbed through the skin and specifically through turf burns, the abrasions that any player or coach regularly in contact with artificial grass will pick up repeatedly across a long career. Carbon black, causing ongoing respiratory inflammation when inhaled during regular sustained exposure, and volatile organic compounds that off-gas from the rubber material when surface temperatures rise in warmer weather, associated with long-term organ damage through sustained regular inhalation across years. Gary Ablett coached at Liverpool, at Everton, and at Stockport County. Years of daily professional contact with these surfaces as the floor beneath his working life. Consider what the pattern of that exposure actually looked like in practical terms. Session after session across a career spanning well over a decade in coaching. Each morning arriving at a training ground and spending hours in direct proximity to a surface that independent science has now identified as containing dozens of potential carcinogens. Not aware that this was happening, not warned by anyone in authority that there was a question worth asking, just doing his job, on the ground his employer provided, in the environment the sport had built around him. The absence of warning, the absence of information, the absence of any precautionary guidance from the governing bodies responsible for the welfare of the people working on these surfaces is itself a part of the systemic failure that Jacqueline Ablett is describing. He could not protect himself from something he had never been told to consider a risk. Jacqueline Ablett argues that the cumulative chemical exposure built across those years may have been a contributing factor in the development of the aggressive lymphoma that killed him, not a proven causal relationship. That must be stated plainly, and it will be, but a credible, scientifically grounded, and growing concern. And it is not a concern that stands in isolation. Researcher Amy Griffin in the United States compiled cancer cases among footballers and athletes with documented significant histories of training and playing on artificial turf surfaces. She found a cluster, a statistically unusual concentration of cancer diagnoses among people with extended exposure to these pitches. 60% of the cases in that cluster involved goalkeepers specifically, because of the repeated diving that sends them face first directly into the rubber particulate cloud with every session across their entire career. Among those documented cases is Austin Everett. He was 25 years old, a goalkeeper. He died of non-Hodgkin lymphoma in 2012, the exact same cancer as Gary Ablett, the exact same year that Gary Ablett died. One was 46, a veteran of more than 2 decades in professional football. The other was 25, barely at the beginning of what should have been a long career. Same disease, same year. Both with documented histories of sustained exposure to artificial surfaces. This is a reported concern and a hypothesis, presented here as exactly that. But the pattern it points toward demands honest and genuinely independent investigation, and that investigation has been slow to arrive from the people with the authority to commission it. There is something deeply uncomfortable about sitting with the parallel between Gary Ablett and Austin Everett, a 46-year-old veteran of professional football and a 25-year-old goalkeeper at the start of everything, both diagnosed with the exact same cancer, both gone in the same year. The age gap between them spans a generation. The disease that took them does not appear to have cared about that gap at all. And the question that parallel forces into the open is whether the sport that both of them served recognized the pattern forming in front of it quickly enough, or whether the institutional drive to maintain a comfortable and financially convenient consensus prevented an honest reckoning with the evidence being gathered independently outside the governing bodies. That question does not have a comfortable answer, and the people who need to answer it are the same people who have been slowest to acknowledge the problem in the first place. The Professional Footballers Association and the Football Association have both faced sustained criticism for how they have responded to this issue over time. Former players dealing with long-term health consequences from their careers have consistently found the institutional support inadequate. The organizations that built their commercial revenues and their public standing on the physical performances of these men have not matched that financial relationship with a comparable long-term commitment to player welfare after those careers end. On the specific question of 3G pitch safety, the governing bodies have maintained what critics describe as a consensus of safety, an official position that says the pitches are safe, that the available evidence supports their continued widespread use, and that there is no significant health risk to players or coaches working on them. But the foundation beneath that consensus is seriously compromised by one key fact that the authorities have never adequately addressed. A substantial proportion of the research used to reach and maintain that consensus was funded by the tyre manufacturing industry, the very companies that produce the crumb rubber installed in these pitches. Companies with a direct and measurable financial interest in having those pitches declared safe for continued widespread use and installation. That is a conflict of interest. When the body of evidence supporting an official safety position was largely generated by the parties who profit financially from that position, you have to look very carefully at the independence and the actual reliability of that evidence base. Independent researchers, working without tyre industry funding and without financial stake in the outcome, have produced findings that challenge and significantly complicate the official position. The Yale study is one example. Amy Griffin's cluster research is another. The response from the governing bodies has been to acknowledge the existence of concerns, conduct additional internal reviews, and broadly maintain the existing stance without meaningfully adjusting it. Both the FA and FIFA have publicly stated that the pitches present no significant health risk. Critics argue that the word significant is being used to carry more weight than it can honestly support in that context. The threshold applied to define what counts as significant does not adequately account for the cumulative physiological impact of 20 years or more of daily occupational exposure on a professional athlete or coach's body. Short-term exposure assessments and long-term occupational exposure assessments are fundamentally different exercises. A single session on a 3G pitch may represent a negligible individual risk. Gary Ablett was not having a single session. He was on these surfaces for hours every day, across multiple clubs, across years of professional work. The question of what that level of sustained cumulative contact does to a human body over time is one the authorities have not answered with the scientific rigor that the people inside the sport deserve. There is an environmental dimension to this story that extends beyond individual human health. When 3G pitch surfaces are exposed to sunlight and UV radiation over time, the chemicals within the rubber break down further and produce additional toxic byproducts called quinones. These quinones leach into the surrounding soil and local water systems, entering the wider ecosystem around the pitch. For the athletes and coaches working on the surface itself, this ongoing chemical degradation creates what independent researchers have described as a toxic microclimate at ground level, precisely where the human bodies of players and coaches are positioned for the majority of their working hours each day. Every single failure in Gary Ablett's story pointed in the exact same direction: a dressing room culture that applied pressure rather than offering support, a city that punished a professional decision with personal street abuse, a financial system that handed him an impossible management job without tools, protection, or any safety net. A governing body that has chosen the comfort of an established consensus over honest engagement with the serious health risks that independent scientists are raising about the surfaces its participants work on every day. The system had no safety net for Gary Ablett. Not when he was young and uncertain in the Liverpool dressing room, not when he crossed the city and became a target, not at Stockport, and not when his body needed the answers that the authorities had been avoiding. But here is what the system cannot reach and cannot take from him. It cannot erase those 2 FA Cup medals, one earned in the red of Liverpool during the most successful era in that club's domestic history, one earned in the blue of Everton as part of a side that defied expectations completely. One city, 2 clubs, 1 man. No one else has ever done that in the history of English football. That record stands, and it will stand permanently. The system cannot diminish the quiet professionalism and the genuine resilience he brought to every stage of his career. From the uncertain teenage apprentice navigating the boot room to the experienced coach doing everything he could under impossible conditions. It cannot undo the respect that 2 entirely different sets of supporters developed for him through watching him perform with quality and integrity on both sides of the same city's deepest divide. And it cannot silence Jacqueline Ablett. She is still there, still making Gary's story visible to the people who have the power and the responsibility to make different choices. Her call is not for panic or immediate sweeping action without foundation. It is for a genuinely precautionary approach rooted in honesty. A real independent investigation conducted without industry funding and without a conclusion that has been decided in advance. A commitment to moving towards safer infill alternatives where they are available and practically viable. Organic alternatives to crumb rubber have been developed and are in use in some places. They do not carry the same chemical profile as shredded recycled tire rubber. The technology is real and it exists. What has been missing at every stage is the institutional will to put the biological safety of the players and coaches inside the sport ahead of the cost efficiency of a cheaper industrial surface. Gary Ablett deserved better from every part of the system that shaped and ultimately consumed his life. He deserved a dressing room culture that saw him as a full person with value beyond his tactical utility. He deserved a city that could respect a professional decision rather than turning it into a reason for personal abuse in his own streets. He deserved a management opportunity built on honest and fair foundations rather than handed to him inside a financial disaster with no resources and no protection. He deserved governing bodies that took the health risks of his occupational environment seriously enough and early enough to act before it was already far too late. Jacqueline Ablett is the reason this story is still alive and still being told. She is the reason the questions are still being asked, loudly and persistently enough to matter. And she is the reason that Gary's 16 months of chemotherapy, of more than 40 lumbar punctures, of a failed bone marrow transplant, of steroids that changed his face and altered his personality, of treatment-induced diabetes and Bell's palsy, and a New Year's Day in 2012 that should have been a beginning, but was instead an ending, has not simply faded into a quietly forgotten statistic in the long history of the game he gave his life to. If Gary Ablett's story has landed with you today, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you content that shines a light on these stories. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think. Do you believe the football authorities are genuinely taking the concerns raised by Jacqueline Ablett seriously enough? Based on everything inside this story, the honest answer is no, and it is long past time that changed.